We have much to be grateful for this evening. We thank the generous donors, particularly Curtis Atkinson, who has been supporting a series of contemporary art lectures, and this is one of them. Also to the Blanton Musum of Art for allowing us to participate in this exhibition, particularly at an accelerated speed, and of course to the artist and to our production team who have accomplished miracles in the last 2 weeks. Reminders, immediately following this event, there will be a book signing with the authors of the book and upstairs, and we encourage everyone to attend. It is a beautifully written and illustrated collection representing some of the very best pieces of Nina's career, and so I strongly recommend it. I bought 2 signed copies when I saw it at Stanford. And there will be refreshments served there, and we would also ask that immediately following the presentation, if we let Veronica and Nina have time to just get upstairs before we follow them immediately thereafter. The talk will be recorded today, so if you want to ask questions, please wait till the mic arrives with you so that we can have a good quality recording to share with others, including Curtis Atkinson, who's traveling right now. We want him to be able to experience this. So let me introduce the artist. Nina Katchadourian is an interdisciplinary artist whose work includes video, performance, sound, sculpture, photography, and public projects. Her video, Accent Elimination, which is part of the curator exhibition, was included in the 2015 Venice Biennale, but not just included, in the Armenian Pavilion, which won the Golden Lion for Best National Participation that year. Group exhibitions by the artist have also included the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Serpentine Gallery, London, the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, SF MoMA, Brooklyn Museum, MoMA PS1, and MoMA PS1. In 2016, Katchadourian created, quote, Dust Gathering, an audio tour on the subject of dust for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Let's see, Curator, a solo mid-career survey of her work, originated at the Blanton Musum of Art in Austin, Texas, traveled to the Cantor Art Center at Stanford University, and concludes its tour here at the BYU MOA. Katchadourian's work is in public and private collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Morgan Library, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Saatchi Gallery. She double majored in literature and visual art as an undergraduate at Brown University and has a master's in fine art from UC San Diego. Katchadourian lives and works in Brooklyn and Berlin, and she is an associate professor on the faculty of Gallatin School of Individualized Study at New York University. She's represented by Catherine Clark Gallery, both in New York and in San Francisco, where it happens to be located on Utah Street. A little prescient. Victoria Roberts. Sorry, of course. I didn't say Victoria last time, did I? Veronica Roberts is a curator of modern contemporary art at the Blanton Musum of Art at the University of Texas at Austin. During her tenure at the Blanton, Roberts has curated numerous exhibitions, including Nina Katchadourian Curator in 2017, Donald Moffat, 2015-16, and Converging Lines, Eva Hesse and Saul Lewitt, 2014. She previously served in curatorial positions at the Museum of Modern Art, the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. She holds an MA in the History of Art and Architecture from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and a BA in Art History from Williams College. Please join me in welcoming Nina Katchadourian and Veronica Roberts.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can use this. Yeah, I got my own.
You got your fancy ones. Well, we just want to say how thrilled we both are to be here. Neither of us sees nearly enough snow, and Utah definitely has the best snow that we have ever seen, but we have also been so generously welcomed by everyone at BYU. Jana, Mark, Kenneth, Philip, and we also wanted to thank the amazing crew, which Mark is right, they have performed miracles for 2 weeks, working very hard. And I also wanted to just say thank you to Colin Bradford and also to Peter and Daniel Everett. We've been really just so warmly welcomed here, so thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Yes. All right. And I also want to thank Catherine Clark, who is in the audience, who is on Utah Street, who you heard about. And,
I had not put that together. It's really funny. Yeah.
And I was thinking about it, and I think we are going to talk tonight. We're going to make sure to leave some time. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes, have a conversation, and guide you through some of the works in the show, and then leave it open for questions and answers at the end. But we're also going to talk a little bit about how why we came up with the show, how we began to sort of work together, which I think we've known each other now almost 8 years.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a tiny bit about the catalog too, because catalogs are their own projects and take a ton of time and effort, and we really loved this project, and so we'll talk a little bit about.
We're not trying to give you a hard sell on the book.
No, we're not.
It's just we're so enthusiastic about sharing it.
Exactly.
And it was sort of a thing unto itself. That's true.
Can you hear us all fine, everyone?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So should we begin with the first image?
I thought it might be interesting to show you all this first, because one thing, given that a lot of you are students studying art, we thought it might be nice to actually talk a little bit about, or I thought I would say a little bit about what happened when I started studying art. This is the oldest piece in the show, and I made this when I was a senior in college. And the assignment was to respond to a cover of Time magazine that had a wrapped globe by the artist Christo and Jean Paul. And we kind of were given this, and the professor said, make something that responds to this. It's due in 2 weeks. So I sat down with a big paper map of the world and an X-Acto knife and a big piece of white paper the same size that I watercolored blue, a little bit sort of splotchily and randomly. And then I just began chopping up this map and moving little pieces of it from the map side to the blank side until I had eventually sort of rearranged the whole world. Some of this was done sort of quite purposefully. I thought about historical relationships, sometimes colonial relationships, language things, but the effect I wanted in the end was really that you would look at this map and think, something's wrong, but you can't immediately sort of tell what's wrong, because I would play with the way that sometimes a continent moves into the shape of another continent, and that would be familiar, but then everything would be sort of unfamiliar. It was a very interesting thing for me to have this piece included in the show, because I had not seen this since I was 21 years old. And it was a very interesting thing to revisit and to sort of, there are a lot of tiny things that have been moved around. I'm sort of constantly making little jokes with the writing and the language of the map. And I'd forgotten most of them. So it was as if I was sort of being surprised by my younger self all over again. A really cool experience. And Veronica pointed out that Provo is on this map. So you can see, you guys are there. And you're also now in a different kind of proximity to Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Argentina, I think, up there somewhere, Venezuela. So Afghanistan has a nice coastline now. There are lots of things here that are changed and different. And I think this would also probably make the point pretty clearly that I was not interested in hiding my tracks. It's very much made with a blade. And it was very much a pre-Photoshop moment. I had not learned how to use digital tools yet. No one was really using them yet. This was 1989. So that's maybe a sort of way in to saying that the earliest work I made had to do with the view of a world as a sort of scrambled and disoriented place. I grew up in a family, we'll be telling a lot of family stories tonight, I think, but a family that comes from sort of a little bit here and a little bit there, and there are a lot of sort of mashing up of locations in my own personal history. This piece is also in the show. This was made once I got to graduate school, having moved from the West Coast where I grew up in California to the East Coast to go to college, and then having moved back to the West Coast again to go to graduate school. And this was sort of the shape of the US that I had lived in at that point. I had never really been in the middle. I had just been sort of on the edges and moving from edge to edge. And it's one of the reasons why this has been a really, really wonderful show to get to do, because this is a part of the country I have not spent that much time in. So in my map, in my scheme here, it was very important to me that you could drive this map. So you could get in your car, start in New York City or anywhere on the East Coast, and actually kind of navigate the highways to get to the West Coast. It's a drivable map. So.
And so Nina, can you share a little bit about your interest, where this comes from, your interest in geography? You said that it comes in part from your own family being a scrambled world map. Maybe you could share a little bit more about that.
Sure. My parents, in any sort of logical world, my parents should never have met. They are the result of a very, very, very smart matchmaking-minded friend who sort of set my mom up on a more or less kind of an international blind date with my dad. So my mom grew up in Finland. That's a very brief way of sort of explaining where she's from. And my father is Armenian, but grew up mostly in Lebanon. And so Lebanon in the 60s was a very sort of happening, exciting, amazing place. A lot of people were going to Beirut. It was known as the Paris of the Middle East. And my mom had a friend who was living there with her husband, an American friend. And she met my father and thought my father would really like my mom and convinced my mom to come and work for him. The whole thing was really just a setup to get them to meet. So they met, and they got engaged 6 weeks after they met, and married 6 months after they met. And they've often said, and they're still happily married, and they've often said to me, please don't ever they used to say, please don't ever do that to us. It was very stressful for our families. So, so that's sort of the scrambled, the way that the world scrambled them together. Yes. And I wouldn't be sitting here had that not happened. So.
And I know that I learned the fact, we're learning a lot about BYU, but I learned a fact that you are among, I think, the most multilingual campuses in the country. And so I can see why Nina's show appealed to the museum here, and I think will resonate. Her mother makes us all look really lazy because her mother, Stina, speaks 7 languages fluently. So that's something to aspire to. And your dad's not too shabby either.
My dad speaks, I think, 5.
And Nina and I are like together, not even near either of them combined. But you're working.
I'm living half the year in Germany right now. I'm desperately trying to learn German, so that's I've got grammar in my head a lot at the moment. But
yeah, and I think that you'll see in the show that there's really a constant current of language and translation and mistranslation that's a really important part of the show.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up mistranslation, because I think that there's sort of a methodology, I guess, that runs through a lot of what I do that often involves working with mistakes that happen. And I'm sort of a real fan of mistakes. I think that mistakes and sort of missteps and things that like suddenly you're kind of on track but then get awkward, those are moments that I'm very attracted to and I often kind of watch out for. I feel like there's a lot of latent content often for me in those moments in the world where things are kind of not quite as they're supposed to be. And I'm always trying to watch out for those things, as well as the moments that I myself am misunderstanding about what's out there. Yeah. So we can talk about that as we go on too. Yeah. I thought I would sort of show you a few more maps. So I mentioned my mother's from Finland. This has been a very formative place for me growing up because we used to spend summers as a family. We would travel all the way from California to Finland to this little tiny island community. Finland has an enormous archipelago, and I'm kind of zooming in here. And this is this group of islands among hundreds and thousands in the Finnish archipelago that we are all very, very attached to. And I had these very idyllic childhood summers growing up in this place. My mother and her mother grew up spending summers on this little island group. This is a picture of my grandmother holding me as a kid. Fiercely, I have this picture in my studio and I look at it when I feel like I need courage because her grip on me looks so protective somehow. She was a very serious amateur artist. It was never her profession, but she drew, she painted, she was a very keen observer of nature. She did a lot of small pen and ink drawings of plants and flowers and things like that. And my grandfather, standing here with me at the shore, was a very keen, I would call him a very keen amateur naturalist who used to keep unbelievably careful track of the birds that nested every year on our property and the plants that grew, and encouraged us to learn the Latin names of things. And I think I kind of generally from these two people got the message that it was important to pay attention and to sort of be interested in these kinds of things. So a lot of time was spent sort of saying like, this is the name of this tree and here's what here's what these birds do. And here's, in fact, speaking of birds, my brother and me and my grandfather feeding birds, which we did on a particular rock surface with a particular rock that we smashed up these peanuts with. And there were a lot of sort of little rituals like this of life there. I've often been struck by the propensity or the large number of pictures in our family photo album of people hunched over the ground doing things. So this is my grandfather planting some kind of small small, like succulent plants into this crevice of the rock. And these little sort of rock crevices are constantly being gardened by all of us. And then another picture I found was him and my mom bending over some crevice where they're planting a tree. And there are so many pictures like this where they're kind of tending to nature, trying to kind of coax it along in one or another way. This is just a shot from our family album where my mother has captioned it, "A creature of the woods," and that's me crawling around and climbing trees. And I was very fortunate to have a kind of a real sort of wonderland to play in there. A lot of time was spent just poking around at things and observing things and just letting things take their time. I think that's often what it was too. And arguably, these experiences led to works like this, which is one of the projects in the show called Mended Spiderwebs, where in 1998, once I was an adult still acting like a child a little bit, I found myself one summer looking at spiderwebs that were broken and having the thought that, maybe I could fix them. So I spontaneously acted on that idea. I went up to the house, found a little spool of red thread, some tweezers, some little scissors in the sewing kit, and started patching up these webs. And, that was fun, and it was sort of interesting to see how well I could do it. But the really interesting thing happened the next day when I came back and found that all these patches that had been in the web had been kicked out by the spider. And the spider had fixed the web the right way, and the web wasn't abandoned at all. I was sure that it had been. So at that point, then it got interesting, because then we were in this kind of battle of one-upmanship. Who knows how to fix the web the best way? And we're sort of competing with one another. And so there's a suite of works you'll see in the show that involve my attempts to mend spider webs.
And I love the series that she refers to this body of work and others as uninvited collaborations with nature.
Right.
And I just love the idea of an uninvited collaboration.
Yeah.
But
that word is important too, because I think, I'm keenly, and with every passing year, I'm sorry to say, more keenly aware of how the human relationship to the natural world, or even the fact that we sometimes think of those as separate things, has led to a real crisis, and we have a really big problem on our hands. So, what began in 1998 for me as sort of a very playful project, now to me has a little bit more of a sort of quite somber undertone, and our sort of human hubris, and I don't know, I wish we would stop sort of competing so much with nature, actually, and in some ways integrate ourselves or collaborate more or rethink the relationship that we need to have. And
I think that in a way, I like the word that you use, hubris, but I think it goes back to mistranslation too, like that you thought you could sort of act like the spider, and in fact, you didn't appreciate, that in a way, I think that the spider had no interest in participating in this. So I think there is a sort of mistranslation here too.
It's intentionally meddlesome.
I
think I got a review once about this work that said, like a meddlesome parent, Katchadourian proceeds to blah, blah, blah. So that was sort of the feel I wanted. I didn't want it to be entirely kind of do-goody towards the spider. It's meant to be a little obnoxious, actually. So.
And I think I think this is a sort of an amazing project, but it goes back to Nina often works with the most ordinary materials, sort of things that already exist in the world that we walk past. We've all seen broken spider webs before, but how many of us have thought to mend them? And so I think that notion of paying attention. I mean, I realized more as looking at the show. Once you get to once you see it all together, I realized how much your childhood in Finland and that all those crouching over rocks. And I've actually was lucky enough to go there this past summer, and Nina she's named practically all the rocks. Like she's like, this is the one my brother was afraid of because of the moss, and I called it this so that he wouldn't be afraid of it. And then this is where we'd play. I mean, it was just really amazing, and it was also more primitive than I imagined. And then I found out that in fact it was less primitive now than it used to be. I mean, not only did you have no technology, no television, you didn't even really have.
We didn't have running water.
There
are no roads on these islands. It's very So it's a little it's definitely like not camping, but it's a little roughing it too. But we love that.
I think there's also something very important about nature for all of us. For me, that being able to sort of let go of technology and sort of very distracted minds, being able to focus.
I think that it's also. What I learned, and I had the luxury of learning this as a kid there, is that there was, like I was saying, there was time to sort of follow through on the question of what would happen if. What would happen if I followed an ant around for half an hour on this rock hill? Why not see what happens? And in some ways, works like this are very much made from the same starting point question. It's what would happen if. And when I was in school, the thing I heard most from my professors was quit talking yourself out of stuff. And this was a really big problem for me. I would sort of show up for, a meeting with my advisor or something, and I'd say, okay, well, I have these ideas in my sketchbook, and I'm sure this isn't going to work out because of this, and this isn't going to work out because of that. And I remember once this professor being very frustrated and saying, why are you talking yourself out of things before you have even begun to try them? So it's taken me a long time to take seriously and learn that sometimes, even if I think an idea is sort of half-baked, you have to kind of dig into it enough, see it through enough, make a leap of faith in a way to sort of get it to some next level. And sometimes that means you're groping in the dark and you don't know why you're doing it. And that's fine. You don't have to always know exactly why you're doing it. I often say this, but sometimes you have to do it in order to find out why you're doing it. And that's, I have to even still now remind myself of that.
Well, we'll talk about that more with certain bodies of work, because I think that that's a really important point. And I thought we could talk about the galleries smell really wonderful right now. It smells like they smell like popcorn. And this is the work that greets you when you enter the exhibition, is a piece called Talking Popcorn. And it actually has to do with Morse code, and I wanted to ask you sort of where your interest, I mean, Morse code is another kind of language, but where did that interest in Morse code, and can you sort of explain how the popcorn speaks?
So when my brother and I were kids, spending these summers in Finland, it was the Cold War years. We were sort of very aware of, Finland and Russia have had a very complicated political relationship for their history, through their histories. And so I used to love listening to the shortwave radio and sort of tuning into these Morse code transmissions that I'm sure were mostly just ships on the Baltic Sea communicating, but somehow the sort of Cold War context of that time also made it seem like maybe these were messages from spies, or it seemed very exciting, these blips and sounds that I loved the sound of. They just seemed so incredibly musical and rhythmic, and they were just beautiful to me, and it amazed me when someone told me, probably one of my parents, that it was also a language if you knew how to listen to it the right way. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Morse code, it's a system of communication that was devised for use with the telegraph and consists of these short and long beeps. So you've probably heard it in some, old wartime movie, beep, 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 these kind of like fast code transmissions. I guess held on to my love of Morse code until I got to graduate school and discovered to my delight that there was a course in the music department called Music, Flight, and Morse Code. And I thought, I have to take this class. I don't know what these three things are going to have to do with one another, but it turned out it was a course taught by a former pilot who was then a composer and had learned Morse code while he was in the Army. And he taught the class Morse code. We had our final in Morse code, which was the best exam situation I've ever been put through. We had to beep out our answers back to him. And sometime during that course, I had this kind of fantasy that if you ever got really, really good at Morse code, you might be able to listen to any rhythmic pattern in the world, and it could be talking to you, which is a slightly cuckoo thing to think, actually, that anything could be talking to you. That's, if you believe that a lot of the time, most people start to bring you towards a hospital. But I thought, it's just a question of learning how to listen, and maybe things out there are speaking. So I thought, well, popcorn would probably be saying a whole lot of stuff because it's got this irregular pattern, and I thought I should make a machine that can translate popcorn, and I had no idea how to do that. So I sort of shuttled the idea to the side, and 8 years later found I was still thinking about it, which is often a clue that you should do something about it. And I found a way to make this project with the help of a wonderful computer programmer who wrote this program for me, Josh Goldberg. And so what Talking Popcorn does, and you will experience this tomorrow at the opening if you come, or every Thursday, right, is when you guys... Thursday at noon, it will be speaking. You press a button, and the popcorn machine begins to pop its popcorn. It comes out of that little spout, and the microphone picks up that sound and feeds it into a computer that's hidden in that base. And then a simultaneous translation occurs where these words are blurted out. And it's a very, very gibberishy kind of language. It was not important to me. In fact, it was very important to me that that the coding was strictly interpreting what it said. There wasn't any kind of cheating English in there or any other language in there. So it speaks, as one person who wrote about it said, it speaks popcornese. It speaks its own language. And yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that's really interesting about this work for me, the first time that I heard it speak in the galleries, because I hadn't ever seen this in person, I thought I heard a lot of English words. And it reminded me a little bit, I don't know, it reminded me of singing along to songs in the car, where inevitably my version of the lyrics is completely wrong. Like, I don't think there's any song that I ever get right. But it's like, it's funny how you listen and then you have your own version, and that's what you remember. And so what it really, to me, it's become this, it's a funny piece. It's definitely funny and has a strange voice and sound. But I also think there's kind of a beauty to it for any of you who've done missions or studied abroad or have, tried to speak another language. You're always struggling to, it's amazing how much you can communicate with like made up words that are Spanglish it speaks to this larger desire to understand something or someone that is different from you. And it's amazing how much we're actually able to communicate.
Yeah, those are great points. And I was thinking a lot about that kind of the tremendous goodwill that one brings to a situation where you're speaking a language that you don't quite speak yet, and how much you're kind of hoping you're having the same conversation as the person that you're talking to. And the crazy things that can go wrong, and apropos of misunderstanding.
Yes.
So it is important to me with the popcorn machine that you are only allowed to hear it. You're not allowed to read a sort of readout of what it's saying. You have to work with your ears, and you have to, in fact, work with that fantasy that you can understand it. And you hallucinate a lot of meaning into it. I've heard it call me mom more times than I can tell you. And it is a little like my baby Frankenstein. There are many stories around what this thing has done in various exhibitions over the years. So this morning, when we were running it, we woke it up and it was speaking in this really sleepy voice. It was kind of going, and it has a personality to me. I know it sounds nuts, but...
no, I kind of agree.
Yeah, so I hope you will make its acquaintance.
Yes.
Let's
move on to the...
Yeah, and now we're into another language topic.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is one of my favorite works in the show. There are 6 monitors, and you're seeing what we sort of call the front side. And I've become very fond of the entire Katchadourian family. So that's Nina in the center, and her father, Hrant, on the left, and her mother, Stina, on the right. And it's gotten to the point where when we go out to... you should explain the sort of origins for accent elimination. But I have been with Nina and her parents enough times. Her parents still have a heavy accent, and within a minute of me taking them out to dinner in Austin, the waiter said, "Where are you from?" And 35 minutes later, after he got his full answer. So I actually answered most of the questions because I was so excited to be able to tell their story.
Yeah,
but
you know it very well.
And they were like, "Veronica, you do it. We have to do this every day." But yeah. So talk a little bit about where this piece came from.
So my parents both speak with very noticeable accents. They've been in the United States for 50-something years now, and they've lived their professional lives in English, but their accents are complicated because they are combinations of accents. It's just not a sort of straightforward answer, what kind of accent do you have? So I've been witness over my entire life, curious strangers asking them, what kind of name is Katchadourian? Oh, so you're Armenian. No, I'm married to an Armenian. Oh, so what kind of accent do you have? Well, I'm Finnish, but this is my mother. I'm Finnish, but I'm from a Swedish-speaking part of Finland. Oh, I see. So your accent is Swedish. No, it's a Finnish accent, but, and it goes on and on because every question really sort of leads to another question. And as my mom once said, she meets someone at a party and 5 minutes later she's sort of had to unfold her life story, and she doesn't even know the other person's name yet. So this happens to them a lot. My dad has his own version of this. He was born in Turkey, but it was then, the borders have changed, so it was then part of Turkey, the city, and then grew up in Beirut, and because of Beirut or Lebanon being a French mandate at the time, he grew up speaking Turkish, Armenian, French, English, and it goes from there. They've learned one another's languages, so my mother taught herself Armenian, and my father learned Swedish, and I grew up speaking English at home with my parents, and when we were all together as a family, we spoke English, and I spoke Swedish with my mother growing up. So this is sort of, this has been a very familiar situation for me, of kind of languages and accents, but it's been maddening that I have never been able to imitate my parents' accents. I cannot do it.
And you refer to it as the family heirloom you can't inherit,
Yeah,
which
it's
I
like
kind of love.
It feels like this thing that they cannot pass on to me. It's like this thing that it comes out of their bodies. It's sort of ephemeral and concrete to me at the same time. And I have such clear physical inheritances from each of them in other ways.
Yeah.
I have my mother's nose. I have my father's toes. Like these things I can see, but I cannot have their accents. And that has. It drove me crazy in some funny way. So what happened when I moved to New York in 1996 is that I began noticing these posters around the city that advertised a service called accent elimination. And that was a very strange phrase. It was a little alarming, actually. Like, what are they eliminating and why? But I finally just got curious, and I called one of these coaches and said, I'm just, wondering what this work is and who does it and why. And we talked for a while, and he said, well, people come to me who feel like they're having trouble being understood clearly, and he was very careful to say it's not about erasing anyone's culture, it's about clear communication. And I pitched him and my parents a project. I said, what I'd really like to do is to work with all of us together, so that Sam, our coach, would teach me to speak with each of my parents' accents, and they would teach my parents to speak so-called standard American English. Now, that's pretty complicated, the English, standard American English part, because from the get-go, my California-inflected, or whatever it is I speak at this point, English, did not sound anything like our coach, who was from deepest Brooklyn. Like, he spoke already a different English than me. And, I hear regional accents in so many parts of the country. I've heard regional accents here that do not sound like the way that Sam in Brooklyn or me or you or I speak. So it's just, this country has an incredible array of standard American, and that was part of what I also wanted to speak about. So the task at hand, and what you'll see play out in this piece, is that I asked my parents to each write a script. My mom wrote her version of the sort of, party conversation I talked about. My dad wrote his version. And then the goal was my mom would learn her lines in an American accent, and I would learn my lines in mom's accent and dad's accent. And that is what we banged our head against the wall for weeks with these lessons and practicing and reiterations to learn how to do. So these are just a few process shots. This is Dad in my studio in the hot seat, and what he would be doing is saying his lines, and then I'm off camera correcting him, because I'm the expert on the accent he's trying to learn. And then we would switch, and he would be the expert on the accent, me trying to learn his accent. And then we had these lessons with this wonderful, wonderful coach, Sam Schwa, who had this amazing messy office with framed pictures of all kinds of actors that he had coached, and he had coached all kinds of incredible people. And he found this project, I think, very odd and very fun, and he and my parents really liked each other, which was really nice.
And there's so many. This is an amazing piece. This is the one that Mark was mentioning in the Armenian Pavilion of the Venice Biennale, and we're lucky enough to own it at the Blanton. But I've watched this countless times, and one of my favorite moments is when you hear them all saying their last name, Katchadourian, and no one in the family pronounces it the same way. And I'm like, what a beautiful idea that even within a family Roberts, my family, we all pronounce it the same way. But I thought there was something really beautiful. There's no one correct way of saying that.
And we hadn't realized that till we made the piece. It was such a strange. And then the question became, who gets to be the authority? I mean, is it my dad because it's an Armenian name? My mom is certainly she's taken his name, so she's lived with that name and spelling that name for a long time.
Yeah,
and I have the name too. So.
And it's my password actually for my Wi-Fi at home, because no one knows how to spell it.
Oh, no way. You've never told me that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so if you want to log on in Austin, you can just put in her last name. I always see my catalog moving around because people are like, I don't remember how to spell it, so they grab the catalog. But
I can't believe you did that.
But it's a great name. But I think it also, what was interesting watching it at the Blanton and going through with groups, one of the things that struck me is, even though I'm guessing, raise your hand if you're Armenian Finnish. I've met one other Armenian Finn, Levon and Joshua Tree, but who
I collect them now.
Yeah, but it's so rare as a combination of heritages, but on the other hand, it was interesting to me how many visitors responded to the work, that it's so particular, but then it's also universal, right? There's, people would come up to me and be like, oh, well, I'm Polish Mexican.
Right.
And you'd find out about these interesting it's also a geopolitical lesson about the relationship between countries and immigration. And so it's interesting to me that it's so particular to Nina and her family, but it's also universal in a lot of, I think American anyway. I don't know if it's universal. I would say it's distinctly American, and the Brady Bunch sort of format of the presentation also adds to that.
Right. I've often said it's just my particular family ingredients happen to be a little weird, but so it's such an American story to have parents from two different places who meet, and growing up speaking another language at home, very, very common, in fact, more and more all the time.
But it also speaks to, and we can move on, but it also speaks to the way I think we all try to put ourselves into boxes. So one of the things that I've noticed, the reason your parents get asked 1,000 questions is that people are trying to locate them.
Yes, that's right.
And it becomes this dizzying process where every assumption that is made is wrong. And so then they just dig in further. So it's true, her poor parents, they can't say where they're from in under 25 minutes because people are trying to make sense of it.
Or the typical thing will be, where are you from? My dad will answer, he'll say, I'm from California, and then it'll be, where are you really from? Which, that's a tricky question that can be complicated for some people.
Yeah, what does that mean?
For example, I mentioned, I'm living in Berlin now, and that's a city with a lot of refugees at the moment. And where are you really from, and how did you get here? That can be a very traumatic story for some people. So I feel like my own sort of, I don't bring that question up as conversationally always as maybe I used to,
Yeah, that's interesting.
So, family stories, yes. This is another kind of family story, which we decided to sort of put 3 family topics in a certain order, which moved from sort of my real family to a sort of combination real family, fictional family to an entirely fictional family. So here, you are looking at a family of Playmobil people that my brother and I played with as kids extremely obsessively in Finland over several summers growing up. And this game was a kind of all-consuming, all-day-long kind of thing. I would say that the peak of the game was probably between, when my brother was probably about 8 or 9 and I was about 11 or 12. Each of these families had 2 parents and about 25 kids apiece, because the problem when you buy a Playmobil toy is it comes with more people. So we had to keep kind of incorporating more people into the families, and these families got really huge. We knew all of their names, all of them. They had careers, they had activities, they ran a printing press, we built boats for them, they had a treehouse, they used to climb Mount Katchadourian every year, which was this big rock. And we've staged rock concerts at Christmas. It was a very real, big kind of world for us, the world of these people. And I do not want to give away what happens in this piece. This is a 24-minute film. But let's just say a tragic event happened, and something really bad happened to 2 very important characters in the game. And it was actually sort of a big deal for us. It was sort of a traumatic experience for us. And we needed to do something to bring these 2 characters back. And the way that children sometimes can come up with amazing, unhindered kind of solutions to things, we came up with a way around this problem of having lost these 2. I will not tell you more than that because I would love for you to just discover the answer for yourself. But I'm really, really happy this piece is in the show. Veronica made this tremendous leap of faith, trust thing when I told her as we were planning the show. I said, I'm making a film. It's the first film I've ever made, a first narrative film I've ever made, and I have a feeling this is going to be sort of an important piece. Do you think we could plan to put it in the show? She'd never seen it and said, sure, which most people would not do this. This is very unusual. So.
It was the best decision imaginable. It's, video tends to be, I feel like contemporary video is often very hard. I mean, I've been into videos where, especially if you hit it at the wrong time or you enter at the wrong moment, that people will walk out, 2 seconds later. And this one's 24 minutes and 24 seconds. And I think I watched it 50 times when I would just when I'd have a bad moment, I would just wander into the galleries. And I noticed that people weren't leaving. And I even one time was in there with a friend and there were 3 other people and someone said, "This is amazing," out loud. I mean, that's never happened to me before inside of a video. And then what was also really interesting, and we're not going to give anything away, but a couple people told me it made them want to parent differently. And I was just like, wow, like, I mean, a work of art making you want to parent differently. And we even got this
really
one
nice.
like college friend of mine his wife sent us like the most beautiful note of her two children and how her daughter, they had their own elaborate game, and that they were almost going to dispense with it, and then they saw the show, and then she was like, the older daughter was like sort of proudly saying that she liked imaginative play and like told everyone at school that, and she's like, she never would have said that if she hadn't seen your video. But
yeah, if you have kids, it's been really interesting to see what kids have to say about this. I think they kind of clue into the Playmobil toy part, but there's also a much, again, without giving anything away, a sort of heavier theme that runs through this. So I will be very curious to hear feedback from your experience with this piece. And that, I guess, moves us towards the most fictional family piece in the show.
Also a very big family.
Also a very big family. This is called The Genealogy of the Supermarket. And I made it in 2005, and it has... I do this with many of my projects where I sort of add to them over the years. So this piece has changed. It changes every time I show it, and it has changed in a very customized way for the show here that we'll tell you about. But it began with a pretty simple observation, again, of something quite mundane, which is that a lot of products in the supermarket have people on them. And the way they're trying to sort of sell you the product is by making it feel like, your Italian grandmother, Mama Celeste, is cooking this pizza for you. And I have no Italian grandmothers. I mean, there's sort of these funny fantasies that you're able to buy into, like literally buy into, when you shop sometimes. And I just started taking a long time to buy my groceries and noticing all these people who appeared on these things and buying those products and eventually interpolating them all into a giant family to sort of take this family fantasy at sort of, 150% literally and making them into a family. So I'll show you a few details. There's a lot of sort of exploring you can do here. This was a big matchmaking project too. So you probably recognize the Quaker Oats guy. He's a pretty familiar face, right? I decided he would have a complicated sort of relationship situation. It's left a little vague. Did he have two different relationships? Did they happen at the same time? Was one secret? Was one not? I was thinking a little bit about Thomas Jefferson at one moment. But he has Aunt Jemima as one part wife and Mama Celeste is his other wife at some point. And then they have two children who are both, as it happens, chefs. So you've got the cream of wheat chef there and the Chef Boyardee chef there. And then they go off to marry other people and the family tree evolves.
I love all the breakfast foods too, like it's just awesome.
There are many breakfast foods. This was amazing in Austin. I think you remember, I told you this, but the character, the very highest up, that woman, the red shirt, she's a tomato brand product. But someone came up to me in the Austin show and said, I'm actually related to that person. And I almost fell over. She said, that's our family business back in Italy and, many generations back. But that was tremendous.
Yeah,
So
I remember that, Susan.
Yes, exactly. For Austin, we added a couple of local to Austin brands, and this is what I do every time I show it. I try to find some food brands who I've never seen before from the very place that the piece is being shown. So here we have Earl Campbell, who's a retired Houston Oilers, who's a football fan.
And UT football player.
Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, right. And he now has a sort of barbecue brand, well, it's a restaurant chain actually.
Yeah, restaurant
but
chain.
But they sell some of the restaurant products in supermarkets. And then the other new addition among several was Michaela Ulmer, who's the little girl on the right, lower right. And she is a very successful local Austin lemonade magnate, I guess we could say, right?
Yeah, I remember emailing you when she was they started to carry her at Whole Foods in New York.
Right, that's right.
I also just love saying 7-year-old CEO. Like, how
That's
often
right,
can
that's
you
what
say
she is.
7-year-old CEO? I mean, I met her and her parents, because she lives in Austin.
And here she is with Veronica, which was such an adorable picture. She came to see the show.
She's amazing.
She was. I didn't get to meet her. I'm so sad.
But she did this video for Nina,
Yes.
and she's like, Miss Nina. She kept saying, Miss Nina,
so sweet.
your work. It's she was so articulate, and she was referring to it was pretty.
Yeah. They
pretty
sent me lemonade later.
Yeah.
She has a PR person who sent me lemonade. It's really an amazing thing. So now and then we have got to meet the real people, and that's been exciting too.
And the frames are really wonderful that Nina chooses. The Earl Campbell one, I think she's particularly proud of because he's got this whole all denim outfit, which and then she found like a perfect denim frame for the denim outfit, and
it's sort of matchmaking between people and frames and people in a way. This whole
Yeah.
thing, but it was really there's nothing factual or historical about this, and I think one reason I like to work with formats like charts or maps is that you see something like this at a glance, and because it's sort of arrayed in a way that is careful and very intentional looking, people often assume that means that the content is true, and so you can sort of play a lot with people's expectations around that. Like I said a little bit about that world map works the same way, but there have been some funny misunderstandings sometimes with this piece, with people sort of thinking that I'm really tracing a genealogy, which I am absolutely not doing.
yeah,
So
definitely not.
and then let's see. So there's you and Michaela, and then we have some well-known brands here too. I decided to pair up the Sun-Made Raisin Girl and the San Pauli Girl as sort of a kind of good sister, bad sister vibe a little bit. And the San Pauli Girl beer brand marries another beer brewing person. They have two strapping sons who are... Now this was interesting because my rule was I was only allowed to work with brands that were currently on the shelf. So I did not go into sort of historical research. So there was a brief moment in time when the old Brawny Guy was on the shelves at the same time as the new Brawny Guy.
Depending on where you were.
Depending on where you were. So I got to use both Brawny Guys, and that was great. The new Brawny man marries the Celestial Tea Seasonings lady, and they have these three sort of sporting children. And then I decided that the old Brawny Guy would marry Mr. Clean, and so they have become partners now and have adopted two children. So the Gerber baby and Miss Sunshine Texas Toast. So they are now a family. So there are a lot of kinds of families, and there are a lot of pairings. I've sort of changed some of the pairings over the years, and for Provo, I have added. Here's your new family members. I have added Pioneers Valley Syrup Man, who's got this big white beard and a fantastic sort of Utah landscape behind him in the upper right. And I've paired him with a Sicilian rub sauce lady whose name I'm suddenly forgetting. Do you remember? Grandma Sandino, I think. Yes.
Yeah.
And they are now the parents of a chip brand lady. And then in the lower corner here, like there they are. You can see them a little better. And then down here, this kid in the green frame is a Tree Street Grains, I think, gluten-free pancake mix. Is that right? Yeah, okay. So he's the newest, fresh-faced child who joins the family. And they will remain in the family as the piece moves forward. So we have had, I've had a lot of fun with this one over the years. And
I don't think there could be a better place than Utah, though, for this work.
genealogy. Right.
I think the rest of the country doesn't even know what the word genealogy means.
I know. So we went on what day was it? We went on Saturday?
Saturday.
To the Family History Museum in Salt Lake City.
In Salt Lake
and
City.
took this picture, which was the interactive things there we both thought were absolutely amazing. And we discovered that there are 41 Katchadourians in the U.S., supposedly. They seem to mostly be in California. And there are 1,099,000 Robertses.
And it was so funny looking at the Katchadourian map because it was literally Nina's relatives. It's like, oh, there's your mom, and that's your aunt in Rhode Island. It's like literally just Nina because the spelling of her name is also a little different from other. Anyway, it was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that was great. So that was a really fun afternoon. So that brings us to sort of the last project I think we'll talk about, right?
Yeah, and I should say, I mentioned that we were going to talk a little bit about how the show came about. And I first met Nina at the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens and did a studio and was had seen her work before and was really, enjoyed the work that I had seen and wanted to do a studio visit and reached out to her. And she had just begun this series called Seed Assignment. And we'll talk about that. But that body of work so blew me away, and I could not stop thinking about the studio visit. I mean, I kind of just had this instant crush on the work. I mean, I just was completely infatuated. And that's always a good sign when you do a studio visit and you can't stop thinking about it. Mm-hmm. And this was at the very beginning of the project in 2010.
Yeah.
And so I realized at that moment that I really wanted to work with Nina, and it was a couple of years later that I had an opportunity to sort of put a show, a show together. And the nature of museum work, people move, things change. I pitched it to a different museum, and ended up I changed jobs, and the person I pitched it to left, and the musical chairs. But when I got hired at the Blanton 5 years ago, I brought the show with me and said that I really wanted to do it, and it was immediately enthusiastically embraced. And at that. And
when I met you, you actually said, we were introduced and you said, "Oh, I have a whole folder on you."
Yeah.
I felt like it was like a sort of
I'm kind
FBI
of a Virgo,
thing
and I have
say.
obsessive folders.
Really
I think
funny.
I've said, that's probably not a good line to use,
No,
that I have a
I
file
loved
on you. But it's true.
And you're my password. Now it's getting really creepy.
Yeah, now it's getting really creepy. No, but part of what I was amazed by, I think that this series, Sea to Summit, I mean, part of it is that Nina's a frequent traveler, as you've seen where her parents live, and summer, spending summers growing up in Finland, and this whole project really emerged from this what if that you gave yourself. What if you were really lamenting losing time in the studio from all your travels? And Nina teaches and gives lectures all the time, so she's constantly on airplanes, and that's lost time. And you thought, well, what if I turn the airplane into my studio and try to make art on the plane? And I loved that idea of, first of all, I mean, I can barely sit in the seat on the airplane. Like, it's such an uncomfortable space, and you have the person reclines in front of you, and you're like can't even move. So the idea that you would turn this narrow space into a productive space is I found really powerful and really inspiring in a lot of ways. But you didn't know whether or not that was going to be interesting. But by the time I did the studio visit, I was quite convinced it was. And can you explain the rules to the sort of project?
Rules,
too?
I mean, Veronica just described it very well, but it also just comes out of a sort of, I guess, optimism that I want to insist on about the world, which is that there is a lot more that meets the eye, and there's a lot that is interesting that we haven't decided to take a close look at yet. So, in many ways, sitting on the plane, this first flight, when this happened, I thought, here I am, and I'm inclined to just pretend the next few hours are not happening to me and sort of tune out. And that's sort of a terrible attitude for somebody who claims to be, wanting to be engaged with the everyday. I sort of was struck by like my own hypocrisy in that moment, I think. And I thought, okay, I'm going to give myself the task of making stuff the entire way to Atlanta, where I happened to be flying. And I didn't plan this. So I had my cell phone, I had snacks that were being passed out, I had the airline magazine, and whatever I could think of. And so the rules have remained very much the same. I don't pepper the project with props. I have to sort of work with what's there. I have to push myself to try new things, and I have to be inventive. It's sort of invention under constraint and under pressure, under lots of kinds of pressure, under time pressure, we've often joked it's also under cabin pressure, and but under sort of creative pressure too, social pressure. People often, you'll see soon why people ask me, what do the people next to you think of what you're doing?
So Pretzel Meteor is one of my favorites. That was one I saw on the studio visit and loved. So that's the in-flight magazine, which typically a lot of in-flight magazines show you sort of seductive landscapes, like you should go to Iceland or you should go to Barbados. And so there's a lot of seductive landscapes that Nina has sort of a penchant for disaster and loves, like disaster stories and shipwreck stories. So, and maybe it's just also, don't we all have that thought on the airplane? Like, I'm actually a very comfortable traveler, but I routinely think, like, what if we crash right now? It's just an inevitable when you're in this tight metal object.
Yes,
and so Nina has,
know.
a pretzel meteor, and there's a couple of, she often sort of turns them into ominous landscapes, disaster scenes.
I mean, but all this is the flight magazine with pretzels crumbled on it and a cell phone picture. And, over the years, I've learned how to sort of use the camera's view on things to sort of flatten and merge these things with one another. So it's also been a lot about learning how things combine. I put this in for the skiing context of wonderful Utah. But they never feed you on planes anymore, so I'm always bringing food. And this was an avocado sandwich that matched the avocado-colored ski jacket of the sky. This is also kind of Utah-specific because this amazing pink light that we keep seeing on the mountains in the evening and in the morning early.
And the first time we saw it, Nina's like, it's just like Pink Volcano, which is this photo.
And this is just sweater lint picked off of probably this very sweater, actually, placed on the page.
Lint has been a friend.
Lint is a great tool. Pretzels lint. I discovered a sort of technique I'm proud of. by one day sitting in the window seat and holding up a magazine page so that the very bright light of the window merged the image on one side of the page and the other. So, if you kind of do this, you get this bizarre accidental collision of two pictures.
Yeah.
And so this image is called Mountain Church. And these two things just kind of, appeared all of a sudden. And we were thrilled with the opportunity here to hang this picture in a very beautiful space in the gallery that has this kind of arch above it. So it's this kind of niche that this photo just has never looked so well placed as it does here at MOA. So that was very thrilling. And there are a lot of these pictures I call transparencies that have been made this way. And sometimes I add nothing to the image. Sometimes I'm just trying to bounce glare from the overhead light on a picture to dematerialize a person or make something kind of happen that looks magical or mysterious.
And going back to what you said about graduate school, when a professor, or whatever school it was, when a professor said, like, why are you talking yourself out of ideas? It's funny for me to even hear that, because the thing that I admire and respond to in the work is the way that Nina, she'll have a what if idea, and then she, and often it's a pretty absurd or irrational idea to mend a spider web or make art on an airplane, but she follows those ideas for so long. I mean, I joke with her that she has no commitment issues, because this has been an 8-year project. She's still doing this. And sorted books you've been doing for 25 years. And none of those projects did you start out thinking, like, I'll be doing this for 30 years or 25
way.
or,
No.
Actually March 5th will be her 8-year anniversary.
It's true.
I'll
I'll be on a plane.
Yes, yeah.
So
of course
it's
you
good.
will.
I got to do something really good on that flight.
But I love this idea, because I think that the series has actually gotten so much better, because the more I feel like you've thought about every aspect of the plane, like, what can I do with the window seat? Is there something I can do with the overhead light? And I think there's also a spirit of limitations, that has really, one of the things that I find so beautiful about this body of work is that she's working within so many restrictions, but I think that this series points out how liberating having some constraints are. I mean, we all know this just from the basic fact of, if you go to a restaurant with a menu with 20 pages, don't you all just order the mac and cheese? Like, I just can't handle that. It's like too many options.
Funny.
Like, it's just, and I think we can relate to this. And I feel like a lot of artists will often create rules or parameters around their work, because it's just, it actually is freeing, right? To have something to push against.
Yeah, I said, this always made you laugh, but I say, I do not like the open field. I really don't. I like having assignments. I like giving myself assignments. I like having parameters to sort of, be a little bit like penned in by, because it just helps me think. I don't know. And this is, the thing about school is that there are people giving you assignments all the time.
Yeah.
And now that I'm a professor, I'm giving people assignments all the time. But it was a little disorienting when school ended and the assignments were not sort of flooding in. I had to find my own assignments. And that was realizing that for me was a really big deal. Like, I had to just, assign myself things and then figure out sometimes ways to break my own rules or find my way around them. But this whole project seat assignment has been really born of that tension of, constraint on one hand and then freedom found from the constraint.
And I think that there's also, I think all of us wrestle with our relationship to our phones. And even though that's sort of a byproduct, that's not where this began.
Right.
For me, there's also I've realized I'm distracted. Like, I'll walk out of work and I'll be like texting as I walk. I'm like, what's wrong with me? Like, why can't I just walk 3 minutes to the car, and look at the trees? And I feel like often we have, nothing's more depressing than when you go to a restaurant and you see two people both texting and not talking to each other.
That's sad.
So I think that there is some sort of fraught relationship we have with our phone. It's become kind of an appendage. And I love that you've used technology, not in a negative way, but actually to free you up and be more creative. And it's sort of a reminder that these things are what we make of them. And so I don't know, I feel like there's an optimistic spirit to this work and that I really respond to. But I also think it's very timely. Like, the cell phone is a way to make art. It can be a way to make art. And
there are probably some of you who have used your phones as a tool.
Yeah.
How are we doing on time, Jen? I just want to make sure we're not blabbering on forever.
Okay, we are blabbering.
Okay, all right.
Okay, we're blabbering.
Move a little faster. This is sort of, in a way, the placeholder to explain what I feel is sort of the time-space of the plane. Like, it's a clock with no hands, and you're sort of neither here nor there. And this is, somebody asked me, are those bullets? It's like, no, not on an airplane. They are not bullets. They are small pieces of rolled-up candy wrapper. But I do a lot of things in the drink well. This is a sweater gorilla. Can you see the face? And this appeared to me, only really in my lap once I had arranged the sweater. It looked, for the person next to me, I'm sure they thought this lady is spending a long time with her sweater. What is she doing? So, sometimes it's really just this like very particular view. There's a whole series called Proposals for Public Sculpture, where I'm trying to make these kind of corporate sculptures, or this is called topiary. This is made of a stack of green peas that I was snacking on one flight. And then you can do a lot of things with just the kind of hardware of the plane. So if you have a shiny belt buckle, you can spy on the guy next to you in it, for example.
I find these a little creepy.
They are a little creepy. I'm a little creepy. That's a little creepy. That's a sick finger.
That's hilarious. The finger does look a little sick, though. It's
It
funny,
does.
like it's kind of the way you've like positioned it.
I know. Fingers look sort of
Fingers are kind of
out
weird
of
looking
context.
if you look at them closely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I'll tell you sort of a series from this project that has in some ways kind of run away and had its own weird life. I had a residency in a show in 2011 in New Zealand, and this was such an amazing trip and such a fantastic experience, the whole thing of being there. But it was about a year into seat assignment.
Yeah.
I'd never really exhibited any of it, and when the museum said, what would you like your show to be? I said, well, if you're willing to take a brave sort of, trust me on this one kind of leap, what I'd really like to do is to try to make an entire show on the flight on the way there, because I have 20 hours of flight time to get from New York to New Zealand. And they said, okay. And I set to work. And I made a lot of things on that very, very long flight. I barely slept. I was sort of like seeing double by the time I arrived. But one thing I did was to sort of pick up on something that had happened on a flight 6 months previous. And what that was a spontaneous moment where I'd gone into the bathroom and thought, there are all these like paper towels and tissue paper seat covers and things. I could make a costume. I've never done that. So I did that, and I made this costume. And I took a picture, with the cell phone again, and went back to my seat and thought, that's why did I just do that? That's odd. And I look like a Flemish painting, and I've always loved Flemish painting. It's the one, if I go to a historical museum, I always make a beeline for those paintings. And it's kind of funny coming from someone who's never made a painting in her life. I've never painted. I don't know how to paint at all. But I couldn't stop thinking about this picture. And so on the flight to New Zealand, I decided there's a really good opportunity to be in the lavatory because people are going to be asleep for really long stretches of time. And in fact, on this 14-hour leg from San Francisco to Auckland, I was the only one awake for long stretches of time. So I could be in the bathroom to my heart's content, making these pictures. And I made a large number of them. They're all in the show here, and along with some videos that have been made in the airplane bathroom as well. This is sort of my fake Vermeer a little bit. It's 2 Kleenexes as a collar and the little mini airplane pillowcase cover as a hat.
But you really, I think that the genius move was using the shawl or the sweater behind her as a black. If you think about Flemish portraits, there's often nothing, they have very somber backgrounds.
Yeah.
And I think that that was, it takes it to a whole other level. I mean, you've got turbulence going on, but it's amazing to think that these were done in an airplane restroom. But the black shawl went a long ways. And Nina's always cold. I mean, who doesn't bring a sweater on an airplane? You're always cold on planes, so.
And then, this project, as I mentioned, it sort of had this weird viral moment around 2011 when I think a press release went out from the gallery. And then from there, it kind of just got bonkers for a couple weeks. My website almost crashed. There was suddenly so much traffic to it. And I was getting these weird interview requests from like CNN and all kinds of things that never panned out, but they were kind of calling. And it was interesting. It was sometimes a little problematic too, because I think the problem with art on the internet is that people basically assume everything is a prank. And this for me was really part of a much bigger set of questions around all these things we've been talking about. What can you do under circumstances where art doesn't seem possible or nothing is interesting, etc. But the nice thing about all the publicity was that a lot of other people picked up on the project and sort of started to try to do it themselves. And the most wonderful email maybe I've ever gotten from a stranger was this one from a teacher in California who did the project with her 3rd grade class and dressed them all up, not on an airplane, but in the classroom to teach them about Flemish painting. This was an art history teacher. And I could not believe how hard they're trying to sort of assume the positions of these sort of
I mean,
ladies and
A
gentlemen.
plus for
yeah.
like the whole class.
Yeah.
I still can't get over this.
Definitely.
And what's fascinating is I talked to the teacher and she said she had tried it with other grades and that third grade was really the best. I mean, it's so fascinating to me because one of the things I was struck by in your show is this notion of curiosity. The show was called Curiouser for a reason. And, all of us as children are filled with curiosity and wonder and ask questions and are willing to dress up and look foolish but there's an age where we suddenly become so self-conscious and we want to be like everyone else. And third graders is like, great, that's before that happens. But she said when she tried to do it with fifth graders, it was an abject failure because no one was willing to be game enough, right? So part of what I've really responded to in Nina's show and in the work is this idea that we should never let go of curiosity. And I feel like the show, for me, one of the reasons I responded to Seed Assignment and other works is just this reminder that curiosity is actually so important in our lives. And I often say that what I'm attracted to in another person as a friend or any kind of relationship, it's not necessarily their like book smarts or their intelligence, even though I find that attractive too, but it's really like how curious are they and how interested in the world. And I think it actually, it speaks to something much bigger, our ability to empathize with one another and to find common ground. I think curiosity is undervalued in a lot of ways. So I just was reminded that.
Yeah, and I think as artists, it's really important to remember to take your own curiosity seriously, whatever it is you're curious about. I think that is the way that you move something from just being sort of there's this thing I'm sort of into, to being something that like really might be content for your work. And like back to what I was saying earlier, but it's taken me a long time to realize I really need to protect that and preserve that and sort of respect that those early impulses towards things that it would be really easy to brush off as just sort of frivolous, but
and we need to feed that, and we need to feed that in ourselves. And I want to talk about the title of the show just briefly because I think
maybe this is a
good image to Nina and I struggle. I mean, first of all, when you've got a last name Katchadourian and that's going to be in the title, you cannot have a very long subtitle as well. So we struggled mightily to come up with a title for the show, and it was your friend at the Morgan Library who I think suggested Curiouser.
Yeah.
And what was so interesting to me, like, of course, there's the Alice in Wonderland connotation, and I thought maybe that Nina wouldn't like that, but I love this idea of, not just curious, but curiouser. But one of my favorite moments was when Nina said, I was thinking of it also as a profession. And I was like, what do you mean? And like teacher, lawyer, banker, curiouser. I'm like, oh my gosh, of course, like that ER is, I mean, again, just the way that Nina thinks about language, that it's almost like I'm a curiouser, that this is like, my job is to be curious in the world. And so I love this play with language and it's just been a fantastic title.
It's been a fantastic experience to get to do the show, and we're really happy it's here.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a good place to stop and do. If there are questions, we're happy to take them. But thank you for coming. Those of you who need to leave, don't be shy if you have to sneak off. Someone over there.
Okay,
And
so
rem-
someone
and
over
remember
there.
to
Yes,
wait
right
for
over
the
here.
mic.
Over here
Yeah.
on the right. All right.
So just to expound on your creative process, you said you're following these first impulses or impressions of things. How do you stay true to that with such a media-saturated world? And I find that people have smaller and smaller attention spans. And so sometimes it's hard to really hold on to those first impulses. What do you do to preserve your creative process?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm as distracted as any of us are by, email and all the rest of it. This is going to be a crazy answer, but I think one answer really is that I actually use my phone. I use my phone these days like a sketchbook. So I see something, it'd be funny to sort of analyze this. We should do this as an experiment sometime.
Yeah.
My phone is a weird combination of sort of pictures where you could say, oh, she was traveling. Oh, those are her friends. Oh, these are, but then some random thing, which no one but me would sort of understand, like, why was this thing documented? And it might be because something caught my eye, something some bit of the material world around us like appeared a certain way to me, and I wanted to remember it. And so, maybe 30 years ago I would have quickly taken out a notebook and drawn it, and now I take out my phone and document it, and then go back to those things, and sometimes then I write about them or try to elaborate them or make work from that point. But so yeah, I guess back to your point that the phone and technology and all these things that distract us don't have to be always used in ways that pull us away from the world. They can move us towards it, I think, too. But I think another part of your question has to do with, is it also about how you sort of stick with it and don't talk yourself out of things? Is that in it as well?
Yeah, I mean, just any elaboration on how you stay true to that authentic production.
Well, I will also tell you, there are a lot of not great ideas that I'm not showing you in the slide talk. So it's not like everything I've done is good. It's some things just have fallen by the wayside because they were just kind of not the most compelling starting points, and sometimes you abandon them and move on. But I have also learned this, I guess, that it is really important for me, for my process, to not always talk about things when they're in that really early, nascent, kind of delicate little phase. The little seedling has to kind of get its roots in the ground before I start talking to people about a thing. And so sometimes it's an interesting point right now, because since this tour of the show is about to end, a lot of people are saying, what are you going to work on next? And I can feel this sort of it's like I don't really want to talk about all of the things I have in mind, because some of them feel a little fragile. And I'm sensitive enough that if I don't always get the reaction, the enthusiastic reaction I want, it rattles me a little. So I'm protective, and I've learned that I don't have to always answer that question with every little last thing on my mind. I'm also married to somebody who has that kind of honesty gene where he cannot disguise. If you ask him, you get a really honest answer, and I have to be ready to hear it if I'm going to ask him his opinion on something. So I sometimes, I've learned to also kind of wait with some people in my life who I'm close to ask, what do you think about this? Until I'm ready to really hear their answer. Until I'm dug in. That's often the way I put it. Until I'm sort of dug in.
There's a question over here. Yes.
Is it on?
It's not on, but we can hear you.
It's really nice to hear you're from California, from San Diego.
All right.
It's nice to hear a Californian accent.
Yeah, man.
Because I'm an art historian. Are we used categorize things, environment, conceptualize things? I was curious your opinion on, because what I've heard described as neo-dada, and I was curious your opinion on how you feel about your work being conceptualized or categorized, and you feel like it's very universal.
Like, for example, it being called conceptual art, or
Being neo-dada, if you will.
sorry?
Or being what?
Neo-dada.
Oh, neo-dada. Who called it that? Someone? In a book? Oh, wow. I haven't heard that before. That's interesting. I'd like to know who said that. What I get most often is conceptualist. And that's a word, we've talked about this a lot. That's a word that on one hand fits, because I think, the way I describe what I do is I say that it's generally a sort of idea-driven practice. That the medium is not the thing I'm exploring. I'm sort of using, or I would say, pick the right tool for the right job. So, here's the sort of concept, and what is the best medium or shape with which to explore this thing. And so sometimes it ends up being a sound piece, sometimes it's a photograph, sometimes it's a sculpture, etc. But to me, the sort of strict art historical connotation when I hear conceptual art is a little bit of a refusal of the object, a bit of a sort of a resistance to something that is really material. And I like making things. I have no problem with stuff, So that has been sort of we talked about this a lot in the catalog, whether we should use that word. And Veronica, who's done a lot of amazing scholarship on Sol LeWitt, where sort of a practice like his meets a practice like mine. So sometimes you hear the term post-conceptual. That seems to be bandied around a lot these days.
But I think what's interesting about Nina's work, there is a conceptual, it is an ideas-driven practice, and one of the reasons I was drawn to the work and wanted to do the show is that it combines, I think people think conceptual art is boring and actually intentionally boring and dry, and I thought that the combination of the way she brings humor and the way that the work is accessible, and that's almost become like a bad word in the art world, which is ridiculous.
Accessible?
Yeah, accessible. That's like saying,
lightweight.
Yeah,
or
yeah, and I think
frivolous or-
exactly, and I think
Yeah.
that that's sad that that's become like there's a rigor to this work, but it also has a lot of entry points and accessibility. And I also think we've talked a lot about humor too as a strategy, and I think that you have a particular brand or kind of humor that. Like I feel like ironic humor is accepted in the art world, and John Baldessari, for example. But there's a certain maybe I don't know if it's earnestness or what I would say about your humor, but that we're like afraid of that a little bit in the art world, and I think that's ridiculous. Humor is such the people that I knew are the funniest are the smartest. It's also I feel like that there's news I can only get through if it's told to me in the form of humor. So I don't know. I think that there were a lot of things that you bring together that, speaking to your point about compartmentalization, Nina doesn't really compartmentalize very nicely. Like it all just get just like
I don't.
in a good way. I think no, I'm delighted you don't.
I'll get to work on that.
Yeah. So. Front, yeah. You were next, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I think it works. Many of us here are art educators, and I was wondering what advice you would offer to those of us who are struggling with the idea of maybe giving up an artistic practice to be teachers, and how you balance your personal work with your teaching work.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. It's a really complicated and important question. Okay, there's so many ways I could answer this. I think there's a fantasy around being an artist that has to do with kind of that blank slate thing of like all the time in the world, I go to the studio, I'm only in the studio, I make art. And that I discovered kind of the hard way does not work for me very well. Like and I'll tell you how I learned it is that I had the good fortune a long time ago now of getting a phone call. I hope I'll have one of these again someday in my life. But the phone call was a foundation saying, we are giving you a bunch of money. It was a grant that I had won that you have to be nominated for, and it suddenly allowed me like 6 months of having to have no job, and the fantasy of being in the studio was possible. And it was a disaster for me. It was a disaster. I was really unproductive. There wasn't enough going on in my, I didn't have enough contact with people. There wasn't enough friction or something, or traction, or I'm not sure what the word is here. I've come to realize, for me anyway, that I'm actually a more productive person when there are sort of multiple elements of things happening in my life. It's actually been often very good for me to have a job. It's been good for me to have the structure of a job, to have to show up, to be beholden to other people. I have been a teacher now for a pretty long time. I adjuncted in many, many, many different universities for probably at least 10 years before I wound up on the full faculty of NYU, now with a quote-unquote real job. But I love teaching. I love teaching in part because it puts me into contact with people who are thinking about art, and we're talking about art a lot, and the funnest thing of all is getting to introduce your students to something where you think this is going to blow their mind, and I'm the one who gets to tell them about it. I love that. I love that. And I learn from them. I learn, at the school where I teach, it's a very interdisciplinary program, they are often studying things different from art or in combination with art. So I get all kinds of ideas from my conversations with them and what we do in the classroom. So teaching for me, just to address specifically teaching and art making, has been very nourishing, I think, to me personally, but also artistically. It can swamp you, it can overwhelm you. I am very, very lucky to have a teaching job where I have a light course load and I don't teach the entire academic year. I sort of have a very full semester, one semester, and then a semester off. But a job does not have to be a bad thing, and I don't think it has to mean that you stop making art because you're also teaching it. I mean, I'll tell you the insider secret. This is what I finally figured out. The way to teach where I teach the best is to teach about the things that I am the most deeply curious about and want to make work about. So if you can just have classes as an excuse to do the research you sort of want to be doing anyway, you will teach those topics with the most passion and enthusiasm, and you will learn. You will learn the stuff that you want to learn for yourself too. So that's not always possible in every program. I'm really lucky also to have that kind of freedom where I teach, but that was a big sort of realization.
What's the title of one of the classes that you teach?
The grad seminar?
Yeah.
I teach a graduate seminar that I've sort of made up called Why Do You Want to Make It and How Can You Make It Better?
I love that title.
Which is a really personal question that no artist ever stops thinking about, or really shouldn't ever stop thinking about. So I'm trying to help these first semester grad students who show up quite nervous about their work and kind of full of sort of, I think, a kind of, here's what my work is about, like ready to go kind of explanation. And I'm trying to sort of get them to throw some wrenches into that and think about where their influence comes from, where their methodology comes from, what their defaults are, what they do well, what they think they don't do well. And we sort of throw all the pieces in the air and they land somewhere a little different by the end of the course, if I've done my job well. And it's a really intimate class to teach. We end up learning a lot about one another. And it's influenced my work. I will tell you directly that I pushed this one semester, I pushed these students really hard, some of them to make work that was quite personal about some of the stuff they were making. Like I wanted to sort of have them go deeper. And because of that, I ended up making that film called The Recarcassing Ceremony. Because I thought if I'm pushing them
You have
to
to
dig
too.
into the hard stuff, I should really be doing this too.
That's interesting.
So,
You had a question, right, in the front?
yes.
Yeah.
Well, this might be
and my-
answered just now, but in some ways temperamentally, you seem a little at odds with today, with the times where everything commercial or everything surrounding us is facilitating, simplifying, making things easier, and problem solving. And I was interested in your personal life as you went into it this last few minutes, because I wondered if, I mean, you seem to see things in an internal way, whereas are you a mother? Where
I'm
you
not.
start saying,
Yeah.
oh, must facilitate,
Yeah.
must simplify
Yeah.
to get the final thing done. I just wondered, timing, I guess, timing in your life.
Timing in my life. I mean, I'm a multitasker, crazy multitasker, like so many people are. I don't have the sort of particular, giant responsibility of parenting. Cats are a little easier than kids, so pretty good at taking care of cats. But I have also opted to live between two continents, and to have sort of a life that takes me a lot of places in a pretty tight kind of schedule often too. And so, so everything is sort of always a work in progress. So adjustments are made as one needs to make sure that the work gets made in a good way. There was a time when I was traveling so much to teach adjunct that I realized it was cutting into not just my productivity as an artist, but my ability to really sort of think well. And I had to change that. It just wasn't tenable anymore.
Yeah, where you can't process. And actually it was interesting. I too work best with, like you said, not in an open field and having pressure. And when I was working on the catalog with Nina, and I knew I wanted to write about the seed assignment photos, and I had a crazy travel schedule when the essay was due, and I was just, it was so, writing is so stressful. Like I just found it overwhelming. And I was having dinner with a friend, and she said, it's pretty obvious what you should do. And she said, you should write it only on airplanes. You've got so many flights coming up. And I was like, oh my gosh, why didn't I think of that? So I wrote the entire essay on airplanes, and it was so liberating for me. And, because I could edit. I mean, my rule was I could edit down on the ground and do footnotes and all of that. And we did a lot of edits back and forth between us. But it was unbelievably liberating for me. I mean, first of all, I felt connected to the series because I'm on an airplane while I'm writing it, so that was perfect. And I ended up making like the subject headers, like what cruising altitude was, what flight it was, so you see in the catalog kind of a map of my own
we have
my own flights. But what I realized is how much, I think we all require, at least most of us require a little bit of pressure to do things, like a deadline or something. But there's a point where like it becomes too much. And I realized how much psychological pressure and weight feeling guilty about things gives me. And so that if I created this set of rules, like once I landed, I couldn't feel worried about the writing. It was just like, I'd have to do it on the next flight. And it was just, this was the most joyful essay to write. I wasn't agonizing over it. And it was really eye-opening for me as well. So the spirit of restrictions.
We have time for one last question. You can be the last. And then we can talk informally too.
Okay. So if young artists had a little receiver in their heads and you had a microphone.
Now it's really creepy. What are you doing here? Yes.
What things would you tell them? If you could like press a button and it's always giving them advice or encouragement.
Very curious. Well, I think I've given you some of the best nuggets that I can think of, which is, you know, the thing about studying art is also that that doesn't necessarily mean every person studying art has to become an artist. And I do not see that as a failure. And this is really important. I went to grad school with 12 people. Of those 12, I'm in touch with many of them, but maybe half of us are still sort of working in some way in the art world. Like maybe half of us are, a few of us are sort of, you know, what I would say is sort of more or less a full-time artist. I would say like someone like me who's sort of teaching and showing and that kind of thing. A couple people have started running like nonprofits and working kind of as art facilitators or curators or you know, they've started spaces of their own. But one of my favorite stories is my friend Scott, who grew up in a town in Southern California, sort of a small town, was a really, really bored, disengaged kid in high school. Like one of those really smart kids who just wasn't stimulated enough and therefore was screwing up in school. And he had a very smart teacher who said to him, you know, I'm allowed to pick one kid a year to get a scholarship to UC Irvine. Do you want to go to college? And he was like, okay, yeah, all right, I'll go to college. And once he got there, he completely like went aflame and became deeply engaged and ended up studying photography with an amazing photographer named Alan Sekula, who kind of rocked his world and changed his life, and then came to graduate school, and his work changed again, and he started making work that had a lot more to do with, well, he's a long story. His work was amazing. But then 10 years out of grad school, when I got in touch with him, and I said, what are you doing now? He said, I've moved back to the town where I grew up, and I've become a high school principal. And every single thing I cared about, making art about, I get to do every day in my job, and I love it. And I was like, that is a huge success story. That to me is, you know, studying art leads to, like, it's a great fit for him. It's a fantastic way for him to have used his art education and training. And he thinks critically about a lot of things in his job that he thought critically about in his work. So, you know, as a teacher and as an artist, I've come up with sort of a very different definition of what art education does for a person than I think the one I used to have. And so that's what I would whisper to some of you trying to make choices about this right now, that there are many ways it can be manifest. And yeah, there are many ways to sort of consider yourselves successful as having taken on this course of study.
Thank you.
All right, thanks all. Thanks everyone.